My name is Vera Blackwood. I'm in my late 30s now, old enough to have lived through a few versions of myself, young enough to still remember exactly how each one felt. I've spent most of my adult life being described with words like reliable, steady, and the one who can handle it. People rarely raise their voices around me. They don't worry that I'll react dramatically. If anything, I've always been underestimated, not because I'm weak, but because I don't announce my strength. I work in a role that rewards consistency more than visibility. I've never been the loudest in the room, never the one demanding attention. Growing up, I learned that being useful was safer than being seen. If I helped enough, gave enough, stayed calm enough, things would stay balanced. That belief followed me quietly into adulthood, into family dynamics, into financial decisions I thought were acts of love. This story isn't about revenge, it isn't about winning, and it definitely isn't about shouting matches or dramatic exits. It's about something much quieter and much more unsettling than that. It's about what happens when giving never bought respect, even when the giving was real, costly, and done without keeping score. It's about how my family took $75,000 from me for emergencies, then called me ungrateful, not because I stopped helping, but because I finally stopped disappearing. What you'll hear over the next hour or so is a slow unfolding. There are no villains twirling moustaches here, just ordinary people, ordinary expectations, and a role I was assigned so early that no one remembered agreeing to it. You'll hear how small dismissals became normal, how silence was mistaken for consent, how generosity, repeated often enough, became an obligation, and how the absence of resistance was read as the absence of limits. I want to be clear about something from the start. Everything I share is honest. Some of it is uncomfortable to admit, especially the parts where I ignored my own instincts. There are moments where I'll describe choices I made that seemed reasonable at the time, even kind. Looking back, I can see how those choices trained others on how to treat me. That realization didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived slowly, like light creeping across a floor you thought was already bright. This is not a story about cutting people off overnight or humiliating anyone. There's no sudden windfall, no clever trick that fixes everything. Instead, it's about quiet dominance, the kind that comes from clarity rather than force. Psychological reversal, not through confrontation, but through withdrawal of what was never owed in the first place. If you're listening because you've ever been the dependable one, the fixer, the financial backup plan, the emotional shock absorber, this story might feel familiar in ways you didn't expect. I'm not telling it to instruct or accuse. I'm telling it because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is name what actually happened without decorating it with anger or apology. So before we begin, I want to ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever noticed how people respond not when you give, but when you finally stop? To my family, I was never introduced by my name first. I was introduced by my function. She'll handle it. Ask Vera, she's good with money. She doesn't mind. Those sentences followed me quietly for years, said casually, almost affectionately. And for a long time, I wore them like proof that I mattered. Being needed felt close enough to being valued. I didn't question it, because no one else did. I was the middle child, which I mention not for symbolism, but for accuracy. Old enough to be responsible, young enough to still be flexible. I learned early that stability was something you provided, not something you expected. When problems surfaced, my parents didn't panic. They looked toward me with relief, not because I demanded authority, but because I never refused it. In gatherings, I was the listener, the one who remembered details, the one who noticed when the mood shifted and adjusted myself accordingly. If someone needed help filling out paperwork, I was called. If someone needed a loan just until next month, my name came up naturally, like a solution everyone already agreed on. No one asked if I was okay with that role. It wasn't imposed aggressively, it was assumed. Assumptions are powerful because they don't feel like demands. I had a decent career, nothing flashy, but solid. I lived below my means, partly out of habit, partly out of caution. I didn't talk much about my savings or my plans. That quietness worked in my favor professionally. At home, it worked against me. Silence leaves space for other people's narratives to grow. They saw me as calm, but they also saw me as unbothered. They mistook my composure for abundance. If I didn't complain, I must not feel the cost. If I didn't hesitate, it must not be a sacrifice. And because I never framed my help as something heavy, it became light to them. I paid for things quietly, covered gaps, solved emergencies before they had time to escalate. I told myself I was preventing stress, keeping peace. What I didn't realize was that I was also preventing accountability. Every time I stepped in smoothly, I removed the need for anyone else to change. I wasn't praised much for it, not openly. Gratitude was implied, brief, and often bundled with the next request. "You're a lifesaver, by the way." That phrase became familiar. If I pulled back slightly, even emotionally, someone would notice. Not with concern, but with confusion. As if a chair had been moved without warning. "What's wrong with you?" "You're being distant." "Are you upset about something?" But when I was present, generous, available, no one asked how I was doing then. I didn't see myself as invisible at the time. I thought invisibility was dramatic, something that happened to people who were ignored. I was included. I was trusted. I was central, but only in one dimension. I existed as infrastructure. You don't thank a bridge every time you cross it. You just expect it to be there. And I was proud of being strong enough to hold the weight. That pride kept me quiet when small discomforts surfaced. It convinced me that noticing an imbalance was selfish, that asking questions would make things awkward, that love, real love, didn't keep receipts. What I didn't understand yet was this. When people only know you through what you provide, they struggle to recognize you when you stop providing it. At that stage, I still believed respect would eventually arrive on its own. That consistency would teach people my value. That being indispensable would make me irreplaceable in the ways that mattered. I hadn't yet learned the difference between being relied on and being respected. And I definitely hadn't learned what happens when a role goes on so long that people forget it was ever a choice. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. That's why it worked. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the tone, the assumption. The way the request arrived was fully formed, without curiosity or care for how it might land. My sister called me late one afternoon. She sounded tired, stressed, and slightly embarrassed. She explained there had been a delay with something. Rent, I think, or maybe a credit card payment. The details blurred later, but I remember the pause she took before saying the amount. A few $1,000s. Temporary. And emergency. I said yes before she finished explaining. Not because she pressured me, not because she begged, but because my mouth had learned that shape. Saying yes was muscle memory. What stayed with me wasn't the transfer, it was what came after. A few days later, we were at a family dinner. Someone mentioned finances casually, joking about how unpredictable life was. My sister laughed and said, "Well, at least we have Vera. She's basically our safety net." Everyone smiled. Someone nodded. No one looked at me. It was said lightly, affectionately even. And the conversation moved on. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. No one meant harm. That's what made it difficult to name. But something in me registered the shift. I had been transformed from a person who helped into a resource that existed. Not consulted, counted on. Later that night, I tried to talk myself out of the discomfort. "They're just joking. It means they trust you. You're reading too much into it." That's what I always did when something felt off. I translated my instincts into overreactions and dismissed them politely. But once noticed, a thing can't be unseen. After that, the language changed subtly. Requests became statements. Timelines were assumed. Repayment became vague. "Can you just cover this for now? I'll sort it out later." "You're good, right?" Good. That word did a lot of work. I was good because I didn't complain. Good because I didn't ask follow-up questions. Good because I absorbed the inconvenience quietly and repackaged it as support. And every time I complied, the ground shifted just a little more under my feet. The moment that truly stayed with me happened months later. Another request. Another emergency. This time from my parents. Medical bills, they said. Insurance complications. Stress in their voices that felt real enough to override hesitation. I transferred the money. Again. When I gently asked, very gently, about a repayment plan, my father waved it off. Not angrily, casually. "Don't worry about that now," he said. "We'll figure it out. You know we would do the same for you." I nodded, but something in my chest tightened. Because the truth was, They wouldn't. Not because they didn't love me, but because they had never had to. I was the one with savings, the one with the margin, the one who planned. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, not angry, just alert. I started replaying moments I'd dismissed. How no one checked if the timing worked for me. Gratitude was often paired with expectation. How my help was framed as proof of my character, not a choice I was allowed to reconsider. I still didn't say anything. I wasn't ready. I didn't have a language yet. But I began to remember. And remembering is dangerous when the story you've been telling yourself depends on forgetting. Once something happens twice, the mind starts building explanations. Not for others, for yourself. I told myself it was a phase. Families go through cycles. That money stress makes people clumsy with words. I said these things calmly, convincingly, the way you do when you need a situation to stay familiar. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't just normalizing their behavior. I was normalizing my own disappearance. Requests became more frequent, but less formal. There was no longer a build-up, no careful framing. Emergencies blurred together. Car repairs, medical co-pays, tuition gaps, business bridges. Each one was urgent in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to name. When I hesitated, even briefly, the air changed. Not dramatically, no raised voices, just a pause, a subtle recalibration. Well, we just thought you'd understand. I guess we'll figure something else out. It's fine. I didn't realize it was a problem. Those sentences landed heavier than any argument could have. Because they positioned me as the obstacle, not the situation, as the one introducing friction where there shouldn't have been any. So I adjusted. I answered faster. I explained less. I started preemptively reassuring people that it was no trouble, even when it was, especially when it was. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day accepting disrespect. You rehearse it in small ways until it feels like maturity. I told myself I was being patient, that I was choosing peace, that conflict over money would only damage relationships. What I didn't acknowledge was that the damage was already happening, just quietly, and only to me. At family gatherings, jokes shifted. Careful, Vera's going to invoice us. She's the bank, interest-free. Laughter followed, always laughter. I laughed too. That part is important, because by laughing, I confirmed the script. I told everyone, without words, that this framing was acceptable, that I was in on the joke, that I didn't mind. Inside, something hardened. I noticed that no one asked about my plans anymore. My future was assumed to be flexible, available, adjustable. My savings weren't seen as something I was building toward. They were seen as something waiting to be used. When I spoke about work stress or fatigue, the responses were thin. You'll be fine. You always manage. Strength, when assigned, becomes a ceiling. You're not allowed to struggle beneath it. I started tracking numbers privately. Not in a dramatic way, just out of curiosity, I told myself. A spreadsheet, dates, amounts, names, purposes. Seeing the total accumulate made my stomach drop, not because of the sum, but because of how casually it had accumulated. Each transaction had felt reasonable. Together, they told a different story. Still, I stayed quiet. I rationalized my silence with morality. They're family. They need you. You don't want to be like those people who choose money over relationships. That last thought kept me compliant longer than anything else. Because I wasn't choosing money, I was choosing respect. But I didn't yet realize those weren't mutually exclusive. The disrespect wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It showed up as an expectation without consent. As humor without care. As gratitude that expired the moment I paused. And the most dangerous part, everyone else had adjusted to this version of me so completely that any deviation felt like betrayal, including me. It didn't arrive as a realization. It arrived as a feeling, a quiet, persistent sense that I was playing a part everyone else had rehearsed long before I noticed the script. I wasn't the daughter. I was the backup plan. I wasn't the sister. I was the solution. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The role was simple and efficient. I was reliable, useful, invisible. I existed to smooth edges, absorb shocks, and make sure no one else had to sit too long with discomfort. As long as I fulfilled that function, I was easy to love, calm, reasonable, appreciated in passing. But the moment I showed signs of becoming three-dimensional, tired, cautious, uncertain, the tone shifted. Conversations would pause. People would look at me differently, like a tool malfunctioning. I noticed how decisions were made without me, even when they involved my money. How I was informed, not consulted. How we assumed you'd be okay with it replaced any actual question. It wasn't malicious, that almost made it worse. Because when something is intentional, you can confront it. When it's systemic, when it grows out of habits and unspoken agreements, it hides behind good intentions. I began to understand that I'd been assigned this role because I accepted it early. I didn't challenge assumptions. I didn't set conditions. I thought boundaries were something you introduced only when things went wrong. I hadn't realized that never setting boundaries is how things quietly go wrong in the first place. There was a moment that crystallized it for me. We were talking about a future family expense, something hypothetical, months away. I was half listening, half distracted when my mother said, "Well, Vera can help with that." Just like that. No pause, no glance in my direction. I wasn't asked if I wanted to, or if I could, or if I had other plans. I was assigned. Something in me withdrew then. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to observe instead of participate. And what I saw was unsettling. No one noticed my silence, because my presence had never been required, only my contribution. I realized then that my value in that system wasn't relational, it was functional. I appreciated the way electricity is appreciated, only missed when it's gone. That realization hurt more than any argument could have, because it meant I couldn't fix this by explaining myself better, or by being more generous, or by waiting longer. The role didn't allow for evolution. It only allowed for performance. And the most uncomfortable truth of all, I had helped build it. Not because I wanted to be used, but because I wanted to be needed. Because I confused reliability with worth. Because I believed that if I stayed useful long enough, respect would eventually follow. But respect doesn't arrive as a reward for endurance. It arrives when your limits are taken seriously. And mine never had been. That was the moment I stopped asking why they treated me this way, and started asking why I had allowed it to feel normal. The answers to that question didn't make me angry. They made me very, very clear. There wasn't a confrontation. No argument, no raised voices, no dramatic line in the sand. Just a Tuesday. I remember it, because nothing about the day was remarkable. I was sitting at my kitchen table in the early morning, coffee going cold beside me, laptop open but untouched. I had woken up with a heaviness I couldn't immediately place. Not sadness, not anger. Clarity. I was reviewing my accounts, something I'd started doing more often, and I saw the number in full for the first time. Not scattered, not justified one by one, just totaled. $75,000. The number didn't shock me the way you'd expect. It didn't make my heart race. It made me very still. I tried to attach it to something tangible, a down payment, years of quiet saving, security I'd built without announcing it to anyone. It wasn't just money, it was time. Time I'd already lived, choices I'd already made. And suddenly, a thought surfaced that I hadn't allowed myself before. What if nothing about this ever changes? Not what if they pay me back? Not what if they understand someday? But what if this is the role forever? I imagined the next decade unfolding exactly like the last few years. New emergencies, new expectations, the same jokes, the same assumptions. I am adjusting, absorbing, explaining myself silently. That image didn't make me furious. It exhausted me. In that moment, I understood something quietly, but completely. I wasn't being generous anymore. I was being extracted from. And extraction doesn't require cruelty. It only requires access. I didn't call anyone. I didn't vent. I didn't cry. I sat there and let the realization settle without trying to soften it. For the first time, I didn't rush to protect anyone from the discomfort of my awareness. That day, I did something small that changed everything. I closed my laptop. I didn't send reminders. I didn't follow up on repayment conversations I'd previously left open-ended. I didn't volunteer reassurance. I simply stopped filling the silence. It felt unnatural at first, like holding your breath without realizing you've been breathing shallowly for years. But beneath the discomfort was something steadier. Relief. Not because anything was fixed, but because I had finally acknowledged the truth without negotiating with it. That was the shift. Not outward, inward. I stopped seeing myself as the problem to be managed. I stopped framing my needs as potential inconveniences. I stopped assuming that love required me to be endlessly available. I didn't become colder, I became more precise. And in that precision, I felt a kind of power I hadn't known before. Not the power to punish or withdraw dramatically, but the power to choose where my energy went. That day didn't change my family. It changed my posture within the system. And systems feel that kind of change even before they understand it. After that Tuesday, nothing exploded. That's important. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. Life continued on the surface exactly as it had before. And yet underneath, everything was different. Because my silence was no longer automatic. It was intentional. When messages came in, I didn't rush to respond. Not to be cold, not to play games, but to feel the space where my reflex used to be. That pause taught me things. About urgency, about entitlement, about how often emergency meant discomfort someone didn't want to sit with. I answered kindly, briefly, without volunteering solutions. And people noticed, not consciously at first, just as a subtle disturbance, like a door that usually opens smoothly, suddenly offering resistance. You okay? You've been busy. I agreed. I had been busy, with my own life. The requests didn't stop immediately. They softened around the edges, changed phrasing. Just wondering if you might be able to help. No pressure, of course. I let those words sit. I didn't fill the gap with reassurance. I didn't rescue anyone from the uncertainty of waiting for my answer. Silence, I learned, makes people reveal their expectations. Some followed up quickly, anxiety creeping into their tone. Others became curt. A few went strangely quiet themselves. And that told me more than any confrontation could have. They had mistaken my availability for obligation. When that assumption wavered, they felt unsteady. What surprised me was how uncomfortable I felt at first. The guilt surfaced quickly. Old scripts tried to reassert themselves. You're being difficult. They're counting on you. This isn't who you are. But I let the discomfort exist without obeying it. I reminded myself, choosing not to respond immediately is not cruelty. Choosing not to give is not betrayal. And choosing myself does not require justification. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't testing them. I was observing. And what I observed was this. People who truly respected me adjusted. People who benefited from my silence grew restless. At one point, my sister said, half laughing, "You've changed." I smiled and said nothing, because explaining would have softened the shift. It would have reassured her that I was still available if she just pushed the right emotional button. Silence protected the change while it was still fragile. They mistook it for weakness at first, thought I was tired, overworked, distracted, temporary. They didn't understand that silence had become a boundary. Not announced, not negotiated, just there. And boundaries like that don't provoke arguments. They provoke miscalculations. What they never noticed was not a single action. It was a shift in attention. Outwardly, I was still the same Vera. I showed up to birthdays. I answered calls. I listened when people vented. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance that could be labeled as punishment. If anything, I became calmer, more neutral. That calmness made them comfortable. And comfort is dangerous because it convinces people that nothing is changing. Internally, though, everything was reorganizing. I stopped thinking emotionally about each situation and started observing structurally. I wasn't asking who needs help anymore. I was asking how this became my responsibility by default. I opened my banking history one evening and began tracing backward. Not just amounts, but context. I paired transfers with messages, voice notes, calls. The language around each request told a story more revealing than the numbers themselves. At the beginning, the words were careful. I hate to ask. Only if you're able. Then they became familiar. Can you help me out again? I'll fix it soon. Eventually, they disappeared entirely. I need you to send this today. We're short this month. No explanation, no acknowledgement of pattern. I realized I had been providing more than money. I had been providing certainty. When people knew I would step in, they stopped building buffers. Why plan when stability can be borrowed? And why repay something that no longer feels like a loan? That thought landed heavily. I documented everything. Not because I intended to confront anyone, but because clarity requires records. Memory is emotional. Records are neutral. They don't argue. They don't exaggerate. They just exist. As I did this, another uncomfortable truth surfaced. I had rarely been directly asked. I had volunteered. I had offered help before requests were fully formed. I had filled gaps before anyone felt the consequences of not planning. In doing so, I had trained my family not to feel urgency until it reached me. That realization didn't absolve them, but it gave me power. Because what's learned can be unlearned. Quietly, I began restructuring my life in ways that didn't invite discussion. I separated accounts, adjusted how visible my resources were, changed how much flexibility existed without effort on my part. I also began rehearsing language, not arguments. Short ones, neutral ones. I can't do that. That doesn't work for me. I'm not available. No explanation followed. The first few times I used them, my body reacted like I had done something wrong. My heart raced, my chest tightened, years of conditioning surfaced all at once. But I didn't correct myself. I let the discomfort pass without obeying it. And then something fascinating happened. People adjusted their behavior before they adjusted their expectations. They delayed asking. They tried elsewhere first. They softened their tone. They added explanations again. Not because I demanded respect, but because access had become uncertain. At the same time, I invested in myself more deliberately. I revisited plans I had quietly postponed. Travel, education, long-term security. Things I had told myself could wait because someone else needed me more. I stopped framing my future as flexible. They never noticed any of this because nothing was announced. There was no declaration, no speech, no visible rebellion. To them, I was just busy lately. To me, I was finally aligned. And alignment has weight. I also noticed something else during this phase. Something that sealed my resolve. No one asked why I was changing. They didn't ask if I was overwhelmed, or tired, or re-evaluating things. They only noticed when the flow slowed, when the default response wasn't immediate. That absence of curiosity told me everything. They weren't invested in me. They were invested in continuity. And continuity had always required my silence, so I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, out of strategy. Because when people don't notice you preparing, they don't prepare for the consequences. The reveal didn't come with relief. It came with stillness. By the time I reached it, I had already stopped hoping for understanding. I wasn't waiting for gratitude. I wasn't even expecting fairness. What I needed now was clarity that could not be undone by emotion. And that clarity arrived one evening, quietly, while I was reviewing everything I had organized. I saw it all at once. Not the total amount, not the timeline, but the structure underneath it. Every transfer had been framed as temporary. Every delay had been softened by circumstance. But collectively, the money had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer supported. It was dependency. And dependency, when unacknowledged, becomes entitlement. That was the private reveal. Not that I had lost $75,000, but my family had reorganized their sense of stability around my silence. I noticed how plans had been made with gaps left open, gaps I was expected to fill, how risks had been taken because the consequences wouldn't land on the person making the choice, how urgency only existed when it reached me. What I also realized, calmly, unmistakably, was that no one intended to stop. There was no internal mechanism in place for repayment. No timeline. No discomfort on their side is strong enough to force a change. Why would there be? From their perspective, the system worked. That realization didn't make me feel betrayed. It made me feel awake. I stopped thinking in terms of fairness and started thinking in terms of design. Systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to structure. And the structure was simple. As long as I remained accessible, nothing would shift. I also discovered something else during this phase, something that surprised me. I had leverage, not in a manipulative sense, not in a threatening sense, but in a factual one. I was the stabilizing variable, the buffer, the quiet insurance policy no one acknowledged, but everyone relied on. Removing that variable wouldn't cause immediate collapse, but it would force recalibration. That understanding didn't thrill me, it sobered me, because leverage carries responsibility. And I had to decide whether I was willing to carry the weight of what would happen when I used it. Not loudly, not cruelly, but definitively. There was no celebration at this moment. No sense of victory. Only a deep, almost somber acceptance. I wasn't deciding whether to punish anyone. I was deciding whether to continue participating in a system that required my erasure to function. And once seen that way, the choice clarified itself. I closed my notebook that night, knowing one thing with certainty. Whatever I chose next, it would be irreversible. Not because of anger, but because of awareness. And awareness doesn't go back to sleep. Clarity is quiet, but it demands action. Once I understood the system I was inside of, neutrality was no longer an option. Staying the same would have been a decision in itself, one that guaranteed the outcome I already knew too well. Still, I didn't rush. I laid the options out carefully, the way you do when you're no longer choosing from emotion, but from consequence. The first option was the easiest on the surface: do nothing. Continue as I had, maybe with softer boundaries, occasional delays, and gentle reminders. This path required the least explanation and preserved the illusion of harmony. It also required me to accept that my future would remain indefinitely flexible for other people's needs. The second option was confrontation. A meeting, a conversation, numbers on the table, feelings aired. I imagined it clearly: the defensiveness, the minimization, the emotional pivot toward how they felt accused or hurt. I knew my family well enough to know that facts would quickly be reframed as tone problems. Boundaries would be interpreted as rejection. That path would cost me energy I no longer wanted to spend. The third option was quieter and far more decisive. Change the structure without asking for permission. No announcements, no ultimatums, no attempts to be understood. Just action. This option required something difficult: letting go of the need to be seen as generous, letting go of the hope that someone would eventually say, "You were right, we should have treated you differently." It meant accepting that some people only understand boundaries when they collide with them. I sat with that for a long time. What stopped me wasn't fear of backlash. It was grief. Grief for the version of family I thought I was building. One where loyalty moved in both directions, where being dependable didn't mean being drained, where love wasn't measured by how much you could give without complaint. But grief clarified something important. I wasn't destroying that version of family. It had never existed. Once I accepted that, the decision stopped feeling heavy. It felt precise. I chose the option that didn't require me to argue for my own worth. The option that didn't depend on their agreement. The option that protected my future, not my image. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt resolved. And resolution is different. It's quieter, steadier, and far harder to undo. That night, I wrote down exactly what I would do next. Not as a threat, as a plan. Step by step. Legal where necessary, financial where appropriate, emotionally nowhere. No one would be warned. No one would be surprised, except by the fact that it actually happened. Because when you stop negotiating with people who benefit from your silence, the change feels sudden to them. Even if it took you years to arrive there. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have thought nothing was happening. That was the point. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I didn't make a show of independence or announce a new phase of self-respect. I understood something very clearly by then. Visible change invites resistance. Quiet change forces adjustment. So I moved in silence. The first layer was structural, boring, invisible, necessary. I reviewed every financial channel that allowed money to move quickly, especially the ones I had once set up with good intentions and never revisited. Temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent when no one benefits from revising them. I dismantled easily, not in a dramatic way, just enough friction to require thought. Savings that once sat conveniently accessible were reallocated into places that required intention to touch. Accounts were separated, permissions quietly expired, nothing illegal, nothing hostile, just deliberate. At the same time, I created something I'd never had before, a personal policy. Not a speech, not a list to share, a private document. It outlined what I would and would not do moving forward. Under what conditions might one consider financial help? What information would be required? What timelines would exist? And most importantly, what behaviors would automatically disqualify a request? Pressure, guilt, assumption. Seeing those rules in writing did something unexpected. It removed ambiguity. When a request came in, I no longer had to decide in the moment. The decision had already been made by a version of me who was calm and clear. That version of me was harder to manipulate. I also stopped doing something subtle but exhausting. I stopped being proactive on other people's behalf. I didn't remember. I didn't warn. I didn't anticipate needs before they were spoken. For years, I had acted like an internal alarm system, catching problems before they escalated. I told myself it was kindness. In reality, it was overfunctioning. Now I allow time to do what it does best. Expose gaps. When messages came asking for help, my replies were brief and consistent. I can't do that. That's not something I'm able to support. No explanations followed. Explanations invite debate. Debate invites negotiation. Negotiation invites erosion. The silence after those messages was heavy. I could feel the expectations sitting there, waiting for me to soften it. I didn't. What they didn't know was that I had already absorbed the emotional cost privately. I had already imagined the disappointment, the confusion, the quiet resentment. None of it surprised me when it arrived. That preparation mattered. It meant I didn't react, I didn't defend, I didn't overcorrect. And because I didn't dramatize my no, they couldn't dramatize my change. They tried to normalize it. She's busy. She's just stressed lately. I let those narratives exist. They were temporary shelters for denial. Meanwhile, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd given up. Attention. I redirected it toward my own life, toward plans I had postponed, toward long-term security that didn't rely on optimism, toward rest that didn't require justification. Nothing about this felt rebellious. It felt orderly. I also noticed something quietly unsettling during this phase. No one asked why I had stopped helping the way I used to. Not once. They didn't ask if something had changed for me, or if I was okay, or if I needed support myself. They only reacted when the outcome changed. That confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't responding to me. They were responding to the interruption of a pattern. And patterns don't appeal to empathy. They appeal to restoration. Still, I stayed quiet. Because silence, used deliberately, does something powerful. It removes the mirror people use to calibrate their behavior. Without my reassurance, they couldn't tell if pushing harder would work. So some stopped asking. Others delayed. A few became sharper in tone, irritation seeping through politeness. I noted all of it, calmly. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. Moving in silence isn't about hiding. It's about not wasting energy on persuasion. And persuasion was no longer my job. The consequences didn't arrive with a bang. They seeped in. At first, it was timing. Requests that used to be answered quickly now sat unanswered long enough to create discomfort. Not panic, yet. Just that uneasy pause where people check their phones twice, reread their messages, wonder if they phrased something wrong. Silence has a way of doing that. When my replies came, they were steady and unremarkable. No edge, no explanation, just the absence of compliance. I can't help with that. That's not something I'm able to do. At first, those answers were treated like anomalies, flukes, temporary constraints that would resolve themselves once things calmed down. No one recalculated their plans yet. No one assumed permanence. They waited. That waiting changed the tone of everything. Conversations that had once been light grew cautious. Jokes disappeared. Requests were rewritten, softened, then rewritten again. People began testing different approaches: casual, urgent, sentimental. Nothing worked, because this time my response wasn't shaped by their tone. It was shaped by structure. Small stressors began surfacing almost immediately. Expenses that had been pushed forward now had to be faced. Timelines tightened. Decisions that once relied on, "we'll figure it out later," suddenly needed answers. I heard about it indirectly. A sigh in someone's voice. A comment dropped mid-conversation. A complaint framed as humor that didn't quite land. I noticed something important during this phase. No one named the problem directly. They didn't say "we relied on you." They didn't say "we miscalculated." They said things like, "this came out of nowhere. Everything's happening at once. We didn't expect this to be so hard." Expectation again. They weren't angry at circumstances. They were disoriented by the absence of my intervention. I stayed calm. I stayed kind. I stayed consistent. And because I didn't react, there was nothing for them to push against. That's when irritation started to leak through. Shorter messages, less warmth, a faint sharpness where affection used to be. Not open hostility, just friction. They weren't mad at me. They were mad that the system no longer worked. And systems often express that anger through the person who stopped cooperating. I noticed how conversations began circling around money more often. Not requests, commentary, anxiety spoken aloud, hoping it might prompt something. It didn't. I also noticed something else. They began talking about me instead of to me. "She's been different lately. I don't know what's going on with her." Difference, when unexplained, becomes suspicion. Still, no one asked me directly what had changed, because asking would have required acknowledging that something had existed before. And acknowledging that would have meant admitting reliance. The consequences continued to compound. Not catastrophically, but enough to matter. Enough to be felt. Bills didn't disappear. Stress didn't dissolve. And without my quiet presence absorbing the weight, it moved elsewhere. That movement unsettled them. For me, it was oddly peaceful. Not because I enjoyed their discomfort, but because for the first time, the discomfort was no longer concentrated in one place. It was distributed, and that distribution was the beginning of equilibrium. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, the window to fix it had already closed. That's the part people rarely understand about quiet shifts. They don't announce the deadline. At first, they tried to stabilize things the way they always had, by assuming this phase would pass, that I would come back into position, that the system would correct itself once whatever mood or distraction I was dealing with resolved. They told themselves stories. She's overwhelmed. She'll come around. She's always been there. Those assumptions bought them time. And time, misused, is how consequences deepen. The stress began to show more clearly now. Not in emergencies, those still felt too dramatic, but in accumulation. Late fees, awkward conversations, plans quietly scaled down. Decisions were delayed because no one wanted to be the one to say we can't actually afford this. What had once been invisible support was now a visible absence. An absence invites panic. I noticed the shift when the tone of messages changed again. Not sharper this time, but heavier. Longer explanations, justifications I hadn't asked for, a subtle rewriting of history. You've helped us so much already. We know we've leaned on you. Those sentences were interesting because they acknowledged the past without addressing the present. They were trying to reopen a door they hadn't realized had closed. The next phase was confusion. They didn't understand why the usual emotional levers weren't working. Why didn't trigger action? Why didn't it land? They tried framing requests as collaborative problems. We're all in this together. This affects the whole family. But collaboration requires consent. And I had quietly withdrawn mine. I stayed calm. I stayed polite. I didn't escalate. And that calmness unnerved them, because panic feeds on reaction. Without it, panic has nowhere to go. Then came the regret. Not the kind that takes responsibility, but the kind that mourns lost convenience. If we had known. We didn't realize. You never said anything. That last one surfaced more than once. And it was true. I hadn't said anything, because the time for conversation had passed long before they noticed the silence. You don't explain a boundary to people who only recognize it once it costs them something. At that point, explanation feels like negotiation, and negotiation was no longer on the table. They began scrambling for alternatives, loans, favors, adjustments they had avoided for years. I could hear the strain in their voices when we spoke. New awareness settling in, too late to soften the impact. What struck me most during this phase was not their panic, but their disbelief. They truly hadn't believed the system could function without me. And now that it was being forced to, it felt unfair to them, as if a rule had changed without notice. But rules hadn't changed. Access had. And access, once removed, doesn't return just because someone finally understands its value. By the time they considered sitting down to talk things through, the urgency had shifted sides. They needed resolution. I didn't. I had already restructured my life. My plans no longer depended on their understanding. My peace no longer hinged on their approval. The truth settled in slowly for them, and quietly for me. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the result of years of unspoken assumptions colliding with one irrevocable decision. And by the time they would fully grasp that, it was already too late to fix it the old way. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations. There was no raised voice, no slammed doors, no list of grievances read aloud with shaking hands. It happened quietly, on a day that didn't feel important at first. My mother asked if we could talk. Not urgently, not emotionally, just a careful message that said, "When you have time." That phrasing alone told me something had shifted. People don't ask for time when they feel entitled to access. We met at her house in the afternoon. Familiar space, familiar furniture. The kind of setting is designed to soften difficult conversations before they begin. Everyone was careful with me that day, too careful. My sister avoided eye contact at first. My father spoke more slowly than usual, choosing his words with visible effort. They offered tea, asked about my work, commented on how tired I looked. They were warming the room. I let them. I didn't rush them into discomfort. I didn't interrupt the ritual. Because I wasn't there to release tension, I was there to observe how they handled it without my help. Eventually, my mother sighed and said my name the way she used to when I was younger. "We're worried about you." I nodded, not defensively, not dismissively. "I know." That response unsettled her. Concern is meant to open doors. When it doesn't, people lose their footing. She continued anyway. You've been different, more distant, and we don't understand why. There it was. Not what happened, not what we did. Just confusion that the pattern had changed. I waited a beat before responding. Not for effect, but because I wanted to be accurate. I'm not distant, I said calmly. I'm just not doing the same things anymore. Silence followed. My sister shifted in her seat. My father cleared his throat. Well, he said carefully, it feels sudden. I nodded again. It probably does. That was the moment they realized this wasn't going to unfold the way they'd rehearsed it. They had expected reassurance, context, emotion, maybe even an apology. They hadn't prepared for neutrality. My sister spoke next, her voice tight but controlled. You could have told us if something was wrong. I looked at her then. Really looked. I could have, I said, but I didn't. The room went still. This wasn't defensiveness. It wasn't an accusation. It was acknowledgement without guilt. My mother frowned slightly. We're family. We should talk about things. I didn't disagree. I agree, I said. But talking only works when it leads to change. And I didn't see any evidence that it would. That landed harder than anything emotional could have. Because it wasn't an attack. It was an assessment. They tried then, carefully, to reframe the past. They spoke about intentions, about stress, about not realizing how much pressure had built up. They emphasized how grateful they were, how much they appreciated everything I had done. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I said something simple. I believe you. Relief flickered across their faces. Brief, premature. I believe you didn't intend to hurt me, I continued. But intention doesn't undo impact. No one argued that. My father leaned forward slightly. So what do you want us to do? It was an honest question. And that was when I understood how deep the misunderstanding still ran. I don't want you to do anything, I said. I've already made the changes I needed to make. They exchanged looks. You mean you're not willing to help anymore? My sister asked. I mean, I'm no longer available in the ways I used to be, I replied. And that's not up for negotiation. Her jaw tightened. So that's it. I considered the question. That's not it, I said. That's the boundary. There was no anger in my voice, no satisfaction, just clarity. My mother looked wounded then, not dramatically, but genuinely. We never meant to make you feel used. I believed her. I know, I said, but feeling used wasn't the problem. Being used was. That distinction mattered, because feelings can be debated. Facts are harder to dismiss. They asked about the money, carefully, indirectly. I answered factually, calmly, without accusation. I didn't demand repayment. I didn't threaten consequences. I simply stated that I would not be providing further financial support and that my past contributions were no longer part of any future planning. That sentence changed the atmosphere completely. It wasn't loud. It was final. They tried one last angle, not manipulative but hopeful. So, if things get really bad? I met my mother's eyes. Then you'll handle it, I said gently, just like I will. That was the moment they understood. Not emotionally, structurally. There was no version of this conversation where I returned to the role they had known. They hadn't lost me. They had lost access. And access is what they had mistaken for closeness. The meeting ended without drama. No tears, no shouting, just quiet, unsettled acceptance. As I left, my sister hugged me a little too tightly. My mother said she hoped things would go back to normal. I didn't correct her, because normal for me no longer meant the same thing. And walking away that day, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not sadness. Relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop explaining your worth to people who benefited from misunderstanding it. What surprised me most afterward wasn't the quiet from them. It was the quiet inside me. I had expected some emotional aftermath. Relief mixed with grief, maybe. A delayed wave of guilt. The urge to second-guess myself late at night. That's what usually followed any moment where I chose myself too clearly. But this time, something was different. The quiet stayed clean. In the weeks that followed that conversation, I noticed how much energy I had been spending for years simply managing my own presence. Anticipating needs, monitoring moods, preparing explanations in advance, adjusting myself before anyone else had to adjust. That work was gone. Not replaced, just gone. And in the absence of it, I began to feel solid. I didn't become colder. I didn't harden. If anything, I became more honest. My kindness stopped being automatic and started being intentional. When I gave now, it was because I wanted to, not because silence would have felt worse than compliance. I noticed how differently people responded to me outside my family. Colleagues listened more carefully. Friends didn't rush to fill the pauses. When I said no, no one argued with me. They accepted it, not because they were better people, but because I had trained them differently. Boundaries, I learned, don't announce themselves. They teach. My relationship with my family changed too, though not in the way anyone had predicted. Some connections became quieter, less frequent, more cautious. There was a period of awkwardness where no one quite knew how to interact with me without leaning. And that was okay, because what remained, what slowly rebuilt itself, was more real. Conversations became shorter, but more respectful. When they asked about my life, they actually listened. When I spoke about my plans, no one casually redirected the topic toward what I could do for them. They still didn't fully understand. But they no longer misunderstood my role. And that distinction mattered. I also changed how I saw myself. For years, I had believed that being strong meant being absorbent, that maturity looked like endurance, that love was proven through availability. Now strength felt different. It felt like alignment between my values and my actions. It felt like saying less and meaning it more. It felt like walking into a room without bracing myself. I stopped introducing myself through what I could offer. I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't mine. I let silence exist without rushing to fill it with usefulness. And something subtle happened as a result. People began to treat me as a whole, not as support, not as backup, as a person with limits, preferences, and a future that didn't bend automatically around theirs. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need repayment to feel complete. What I needed was self-trust. And I had it now. The $75,000 didn't define me anymore. Not as loss, not as sacrifice, not as leverage. It became part of my history, not my identity. A lesson I paid for once, fully, and never intended to pay for again. I don't regret helping. I regret staying silent when help turned into expectation. That distinction changed everything. Who I am now is not someone who withholds. I'm someone who chooses. And that choice, quiet, consistent, and unapologetic, is the most stable thing I've ever built. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain, to decide who was wrong, who should apologize, who lost. But that framing misses the point. This story wasn't about bad people doing bad things. It was about ordinary people responding to a system that quietly rewarded taking and punished restraint. A system I helped build, not out of weakness, but out of misunderstanding. For a long time, I believed that giving was proof of love, that endurance was maturity, that staying silent was the same thing as staying kind. It took me years, and $75,000, to understand that giving never bought respect. Not because generosity is flawed, but because respect doesn't grow in environments where limits are invisible. When people don't know where you end, they don't learn how to meet you. They learn how to lean. What I learned, slowly and without drama, is that boundaries don't destroy relationships. They reveal them. Some connections survive the reveal, others don't, and neither outcome is a failure. If you've been the dependable one for a long time, this part can be hard to accept. When you stop overgiving, some people won't miss you. They'll miss the version of you that made their life easier. That realization can sting, but it can also free you. Because once you see that clearly, you stop negotiating your worth. You stop explaining why your limits matter. You stop hoping someone will finally notice how much you've carried. You notice yourself instead. I didn't get revenge. I didn't demand repayment. I didn't burn bridges. What I did was quieter and more permanent. I withdrew my silence. I stopped cushioning other people from the consequences of their expectations. I stopped mistaking access for intimacy. I stopped believing that love required self-erasure. And in doing so, I didn't lose my family. I lost a role that never belonged to me. If you're listening to this and feeling an uncomfortable recognition, if parts of this story sound familiar in ways you haven't named yet, I want to say something gently. You don't have to wait for a breaking point. You don't have to justify your exhaustion. You don't have to be ungrateful to be done. Choosing yourself doesn't require anger. It requires clarity. And clarity once claimed changes everything. So I'll leave you with one question. Not to provoke, not to judge, but to invite reflection. Have you ever noticed how people define you by what you provide, and what happens when you quietly stop providing it? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. Not for debate, not for advice, just to name what so many people carry in silence. Sometimes telling the truth calmly is the most powerful thing we can do. Thank you for listening.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!